Welcome to another edition of Learning to See, Seeing to Learn with Dr. Patrick Quaid and Carrie Fairley. Dr. Quaid is the founder of the View Cubed Vision Therapy Centers. They're located in Guelph and North York, Ontario. Carrie was a teacher for more than 30 years in Ontario as well, in 3 different school boards. Now recently retired. Congratulations, Carrie.
Thank you.
To begin with, Carrie, let's talk about the idea of teaching. We were primarily in the elementary school areas of primary and junior teaching. As you'd encounter students, as you described it in the book, there are many of those students that were very bright and very articulate, but had a real struggle. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I found over the years that, especially when I got into the grade 5, into the junior division, where you would expect children to be able to read and write to a certain level. Often over the years, I discovered that there was a pattern that was emerging, that these kids were extremely verbal, oral, very high vocabulary, very intelligent, usually one of the most intelligent kids in my class, that could not read or write very well at all. Their other marks would be stellar. They'd be getting straight A's. And yet in language and in literacy, which was, of course, one of our major focuses, they were really, really struggling. And I saw this pattern emerging over the years where I would get like 1 or 2 of these kids in my class that would be like the most intelligent child, and they still were having difficulties reading and writing.
What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Quaid?
Well, I think, that's astute, because when we started researching this issue, I'm going way back into my PhD and postdoc, we started looking at kids who were thriving at reading and kids who were barely surviving, to be frank. These are the kids with the IEP in place, or an individualized educational plan. And a lot of these kids, to Carrie's point, is they were very intelligent kids, very articulate kids, verbally very, very good, but they were struggling a lot with reading and tracking and losing their place when they were reading and spelling. And a lot of them actually were very persistent phonetic spellers. So for example, like the word station, we know it's S-T-A-T-I-O-N, but they were spelling it station, S-T-A-S-H-U-N. So they're spelling it phonetically. And we started realizing a lot of these kids have visual memory concerns, so they can't picture what they've seen prior. And when we looked at their eye teaming skills, we actually published a study in Grace Clinical Archives of Ophthalmology in 2013. And we compared 50 IEPs to 50 controls. And we found that the IEPs, out of 15 visual skills, 14 out of 15 visual skills were significantly deficient in the IEP group. So basically, both groups could see 20/20, which is I can see size 20 font 20 feet away. But when you started to look at things like convergence or being able to control my eyes, there was a massive difference between the 2 groups, but yet they would pass a vision screening very, very easily. So we started delving more into the nuts and bolts of eye teaming, and we discovered a lot of these IEPs, and I think the number we had in our study was 84% of these IEPs who were significantly being accommodated for reading and for spelling had significant eye teaming deficiencies. And that's really what motivated us to write the book, because research papers are great, but it really wasn't getting to parents and educators.
Well, your point about the visual memory is so true, because I would often, and I have I was a psychology major. And so I was always very interested in how the brain perceived stimuli, and it didn't matter what it was. And I started putting some of that to these kids, and even the parents were so frustrated. We do your traditional spelling tests every week. And the parents would say, we practiced and he memorized it, and we thought he had it. And then when it came down to the test, it literally was phonetic, because they could not remember the memory. And I kept doing this in my interviews. It was like there was this missing piece. Yeah. And I said, there's something about how they're looking at it. And at the time, I didn't know really, I couldn't figure it out. I said, there's something when they take that information that it doesn't stick, or the brain doesn't perceive it. And so they literally can't remember it. So they default back to their phonetic skills that they learned in their younger grades.
Absolutely. I think if I actually pick on Grant here for a second. So Grant, if I get you to spell a word for me, so if you can spell the word future for me, go ahead.
Future.
Ooh,
Now-
stress.
Now, tricky, but try it going backwards. Give it a shot going backwards.
Oh, goodness. RE. It's not terrible. Yep, stuck.
Now, I'm going to stop you there because I guarantee you, I always look for the 50-yard stare, right? I'm trying to picture it in my head. I'm trying to go
Yep.
backwards. So that's visual memory. So when you see some people will just stare off the 50-yard stare like you did just there. And some people will look up and to the right and go, okay, it's ERU.
That's what I was doing, is trying to visualize
So
it.
bingo. So you said the perfect word, visualize. So good visual memory is my ability, and going backwards is hard because we're not used to doing it, but going forwards, like if your visual system is working properly and every time you see the word, it looks the same to you. So every time I see the word, it's clear, it's not double, it's not blurry. Every time I see it, it's consistent. The brain will store it. The visual brain, and about 40 to 50% of the human brain is visual in machinery. So if every time I see something, it's consistent, the brain says, okay, I'm going to store it. And then later on, to your point about the spelling test, Carrie, is as a parent, then I ask the kid, can you spell this word? If visual memory is intact, they will spell it no problem. If it's not intact, if they look up and try to picture the word and there's nothing there, their only other option is to default to, oh, now I have to sound it out in my head and spell it how it sounds. Hence the phonetic spelling, right? So in my mind, yes, there are phonetic problems as well with some kids, where some kids, if you ask them to spell future, they throw in P's and Q's and they're all over the place. That's definitely a phonetic concern, and you need to get somebody like a speech pathologist involved. But if you have a kid who's persistently phonetically spelling, that's not a phonics problem. That's a kid who's not able to picture the word. And that's very likely rooted. Poor visual memory comes from, well, if every time I look at a word, it's different. Sometimes it's double, sometimes it's single, sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's blurry. The brain says, I'm out. Every time I look at it, it's different. I'm not going to store it. And you can actually, there was some really good research done at Ohio State a while back. Margin Culp at Ohio State. So big shout out to them. They actually did some research and they showed you could walk into a classroom anywhere from grade 1 to grade 4 and do a test of visual memory on the TVPS test, which is a test of visual processing skills. So you just did a very basic visual memory test, and you ranked the kids in the classroom from the best score to the worst, and you looked at their average grades from a literacy and spelling standpoint, the list would almost be the same. So, and you think about the English language. I mean, the English language is not phonetically regular. I mean, you think about the word yacht, think about, spell there. Well, which one? There's 3 of them, I before E except after C. Well, unless I do a feisty heist on a beige neighbor. I mean, ironically, the word science violates that rule, right? So
Just look at my class and I would just say, I'm really sorry, kids, especially the ESLs, the English as a second language. And I taught a lot of those over my career, that it's just like, guys, English is like one of the hardest languages to learn.
yes, it is. And being from Ireland, originally, my first language is Gaelic. I didn't actually learn English till I was about 6. And what's interesting is I've then been exposed to French over the years, and I hated my parents for exposing me to French. And then I moved to Canada. And of course, French is the second official language of Canada. So for me, it's like, okay, now it's actually coming in useful. My wife is from Turkey. And what's really interesting about Turkish is it uses the English alphabet, but it's 100% phonetic language. So you spell it exactly how it sounds. And what's really interesting, the rates of reading and spelling difficulties in Turkey are a fraction of what they are in English speaking countries. And I don't think that means, although my wife may get upset when I say this, I don't think it's because the Turks are smarter than us. I think it's because they're using a language that is less dependent on visual memory. So the more dependence you have on visual memory, the more difficult that language becomes, because you almost have to do this disconnect between, I look at the word, like take yacht, for example, I look at the word and it's Y-A-C-H-T, but I know it sounds like Y-O-T, but I have to ignore that difference and put it together. And in the educational ranks, they actually call that skill selective inattention. I read that in a textbook a long time ago. So selective inattention, I have to be inattentive to the fact that there's a difference between how it sounds and how it looks. And that skill is actually dependent on my visual memory being intact. Right.
Well, this has been great. Thank you both for your contributions, some ideas here. There's so much more to learn about all of this from not only Dr. Quaid, but also Carrie and the other contributors who've made this book something that's a great resource for both parents and teachers and other professionals who are looking at how children learn and the impact of that on their future careers, on their self-esteem, on their happiness, on their success in life. We've been talking to Carrie Fairley, a retired teacher in Ontario, and Dr. Patrick Quaid, the author of the book, Learning to See, Seeing to Learn. Join us again for another episode when we come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.